Hey everybody, here with your stimulus of the week for week one, our second stimulus. So we looked at our China stimulus first, and here we're looking at our new US based stimulus next. Right? So what we're looking at here is another map, and we're looking at the United States. So we're doing the same sorts of things as we did with the first stimulus. Excuse me. We're looking at the title, the legend, the key, right? The first bits of information that we can get from this map. So what we're going to look at is for a title, and our title usually is at the top portion of the map, but in this case it seems it's at the bottom. Right here we have a number of national priorities list, sites in potentially impacted areas. So it doesn't tell us what the impacts are, but we have all this other information that may give us a clue as to what the impacts we're looking at actually may be. Right, so we have this larger dot, this potentially impacted sites, right? The colored in dot. We have 945 of those, and we have no impact identified at these 626 other sites. Right, so we have sites that are not impacted or said not to be impacted, and then the potentially impacted sites, right, all around. And looking at the sources, is a GAO analysis of the Environmental Protection Agency, all right, Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that's NOAA, NOAA, and the U.S. Forest Service data. So we're looking at maybe environmental impacts, right? And generally, we're not looking for the positive impacts when we look at an environmental impact map. So we're looking for these environmental impacts, and we're probably looking at what we would call these negative impacts, right? We're not looking at the good stuff here necessarily. We're looking at the negative impacts on the environment for various reasons, right? They don't give us any specific reasons, but we're looking at some sort of negative impact here. Now, like I did before, I want to look at my space and see what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the US, right? So if I think of what this might mean for me, right, in terms of large-scale environmental impacts, I'm only looking at the United States. So I've got to think about my scale, right? What kind of scale am I working with? In this case, right? And I have these four different scales that we usually work with: local, regional, national, international. So take a sec, think of where this is going to be. Is it local? Is it national? Is it regional? Is it international? Right? Is it in a city? Is it in one part of a country or a place? Is it an entire country and only one country? Is it multiple countries that we're looking at? Likely you've had the answer in your head already, right? Because we've looked at this a number of times before. This is a national scale. Right, so we're looking at one single country, and we're only looking at the United States in this case. Right. From here on out, I want to do like I did with China, and I want to separate my state into parts. Right, now you got to remember the U.S. is kind of funky. Right, it's a little weird with where the north and the east and all this stuff is. Right, so here this area is the northeast. Right, this space here. This space is the conventional south, or what we'd call the southern United States. This is our southwest. This is our northwest. This is our midwest, right? And the north is kind of lost in here, right? But the north would be this whole chunk up here. But these are the kind of primary regions we get of the United States, right? Now, if we think about what the map is telling us, right? It's telling us about these potentially impacted sites, and specifically about these potentially environmentally impacted sites, right? Now, this is still like industrialization type stuff, right? Effects on the environment, and we can see this as a result of maybe the U.S.'s industrialization, right? If we think about what factories and other manufacturing sites have involved as environmental waste or environmental waste products. And we can start looking for trends with that in mind, right? This Midwestern area, if you don't remember, is also what we call the Rust Belt, right? Because it's where we had a lot of U.S. manufacturing in the past, right? From the 1920s up to the 1960s and 70s. And it makes sense then, right? If we're looking for patterns, right? Because we want to think about where we see the most shaded dots, right? Because that's the largest groups of impacted sites, environmentally impacted sites. We don't have a lot in these parts of the Southwest, right? Not as much as other spaces, right? If we're looking for these clusterings, looking for these patterns, we see that it's pretty sparse in the Northwest, right? And in the West in general. We don't have, and we have a pretty big cluster here in the South, where we have a good amount of these potentially impacted sites that are here. We have huge clusters in the Northeast, and a big cluster here in the Midwest, right? We have to think about, or if we had to say where the most impacted sites are located, these would probably be the two places we'd look to, right? Because this is where we see the largest clustering of dots. And this could also mean that we just have a lot of factory locations, right, in these spaces, because that's maybe where they're going to measure the impacted areas. That in mind, it makes sense that the Rust Belt is one of these areas because that is where the factories and manufacturing stuff was centered for a very long time, as well as in these areas around New York and New Jersey, right, in the Northeast. Now, aside from this, we can look at other areas of the U.S., right, to see regionally how these impacts have played out, right? Because since we're looking at this one scale, we're looking at this one country, our conclusions may be different depending on the scale that we use. So maybe if we look at the U.S. as a whole, we can see, wow, there's a lot of impacted sites that are going on. But we can also split our thinking into a regional scale based on the United States, right? And we can start thinking about something similar to breaking the U.S. into its different regions. And that may lead us to different conclusions based on the scale, right? Our scale of analysis, as we zoom in and zoom out, we start to get different conclusions at times because the information that we get at different scales can be different. So nationally, while we might say we have a large number of environmental impacts, right? The U.S. has had a lot of impact on the environment, potentially from industrial sources. We also have to think about the regional scales. Right? If we look just at the Northwest, this is a very different picture than looking at the entire United States. Because here, if we look just at this western portion of the U.S., we'd say, well, the impacted concentrations, right, where we see the most impacts, may be different, right? We may not have such a conclusion as to say the Northeast or the Midwest have large concentrations, right? If we're just looking at this space here, our answers may be different. And they are going to be different for our purposes if we think about the regional scale in the western United States. Here we might say the concentrations for environmentally impacted areas are in California or in Oregon and Washington, right? Or along the western coast, right? With the Pacific Ocean, right? Those might be other answers that we get in this case. Now, if we focus, let's say, somewhere else, right, on a different region, right, because we have this compare and contrast that we can do, and we started to think about maybe not the western United States, but if we started to think about the southwestern United States instead, right, here we might make similar or different conclusions too. Right? Maybe if we're including Texas here, right, we have some clusters here in Texas, some clusters here in New Mexico, but California still seems to be that one source where we have a lot of clustering of these environmentally impacted areas. Right? The information, depending on the scale that we're working with, began to differ. Right? And that means that depending on the scale we use, whether we're looking at the national scale, right, we're looking at the entire United States, or whether we're looking at a regional scale and we're just looking at a portion of the United States, right, our conclusions may be different with where the highest concentrations are located, right? On this national scale, that's going to be the Northeast and the Midwest. And on our regional scales, it looks like that's going to be maybe California and on the West Coast, right? We may make other conclusions too, where we might say, well, if we just look at the Western United States, these environmental impacts, they don't look that bad. Yeah, we have, a lot of impacted or potentially impacted sites, but we also have a lot of these no impact identified sites, right? There's not as much going on there, right? The U.S. is fine. There's nothing at issue with the environmental impacts. If we look at the Eastern United States, we have a very different picture, right? We see lots and lots of potentially impacted areas. And again, that just depends on the scale that we're using, right? With this type of question, and even with the type of question we looked at before, right, scale is going to play a big part in what kind of conclusions we can draw from data, right? And that's what both of these stimuli are. They're forms of data presentation. They just happen to choose a map in this case. And maps, fortunately for us, are pretty good with presenting scale and thinking about scale. Right? And when you think about crafting your questions for this particular stimulus, those are probably the questions you want to have in mind. right? We want to know that we're looking at potentially impacted sites and that we're having to do with the environment in this question, right? Because this is from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So these impacted sites are maybe about environmental impacts. Maybe we're thinking about what causes environmental impacts or the effect of some specific cause that we've learned about on those particular areas, right? What kinds of impacts could happen. Maybe we're thinking about scale questions, right? How looking at different scales can affect the way we interpret the data, right? Or the conclusions that we draw, right? Maybe we want to think about a regional scale on one end and what kind of conclusion we get from that data. But then we also want to think about the national scale and think about how we have a different conclusion based on using that scale instead, right? Based on how we zoom in or zoom out, right, on where we're looking, that's going to change the way that we interpret this data, and it's going to change the way that we figure out our answers, right, to these types of questions. Scale matters, right? Whether you zoom in or zoom out, your answers may be different, and that's important because that also means that the information you receive is different too. And that means the decisions that you make, well, they may not always be the same. So we want to be thinking about scale. We want to be thinking about the differences in looking at different scales of analysis. For this question, even for the previous question too, right? Scale definitely applies in both of these cases. So as you're crafting your questions, keep these things in mind. Right? At the very least, when we're thinking about maps or we have a map as a stimulus, scale is always going to matter. And for most every stimulus, you're always going to be able to tie things back to ESPN, right? Economic, social, political, environmental factors that could be the reason why the map looks the way it looks. As always, office hours, emailing me, contacting me through Teams or Remind, here to help in any way that I can and to support you in any way that I can so you get all the points that you want for crafting your self-created FRQs. Hopefully this proved a good foundation, just like the other video. Again, these are available for you whenever you need them. So feel free to watch again or to reach out if you have more questions. Bye.